Imagine this. Companies getting billions of your tax dollars, but then they're accused of holding back extraordinary data about life-saving vaccines. And at the same time, Americans, well, we're paying way more for essential medicines than almost anyone else in the developed world. Significantly more. Right now, President Donald Trump isn't just imagining it. He's demanding a reckoning. He's pushing for big changes that could seriously reshape pharma policy and maybe rebuild some public trust. And it's not just him. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is apparently in, well, turmoil grappling with these exact same questions. Transparency, efficacy, this isn't some abstract debate. It hits your wallet, it affects what you know about vaccines and who you trust with your health, your money. So today we're going to try and cut through some of the noise on two frankly explosive issues: drug pricing and vaccine transparency, all straight from the headlines. In this deep dive, we'll unpack the intense pressure building on these drug companies. We'll look at some surprising alliances forming around these issues and what it all really means for you, the American consumer, the patient. We'll navigate the, let's say, intricate details of drug pricing, get into the fierce debate over vaccine data, and look at this high-stakes battle for public trust.
Yeah, and our sources really paint a vivid picture here. It's contentious. We're drawing from recent reports on President Trump's demand, some in-depth analyses on pharma innovation, and interestingly, survey data showing what people actually think. We'll cover perspectives from different political figures, industry folks, policy experts. It really reveals how complex these debates are right now.
Okay, let's unpack this first, focusing on where the conservative movement seems to be landing. President Trump has taken an incredibly aggressive stance on what he calls exorbitant pharmaceutical pricing. And he's not just talking. He issued that executive order, remember, delivering most favored nation prescription drug pricing to American patients. And that most favored nation part, it essentially means he wants the U.S. to pay no more for drugs than the lowest price paid by other similar developed nations. It's a direct hit against the idea that Americans should basically subsidize global drug costs.
It is fascinating how direct he's being. I mean, a real unvarnished challenge to the drug makers. Trump says Americans often pay up to 3 times more for the exact same brand name drugs compared to other developed countries. He's demanding immediate relief. And he sent letters, to 17 pharma CEOs, the big ones, Pfizer, Eli Lilly, Merck, pushing for binding commitments by September 29th. This feels like more than just negotiation.
Oh, definitely. He's making it crystal clear his administration sees other developed nations as, quote, freeloading on U.S. innovation. And that, quote, it is time they pay their fair share. It's not just asking nicely. He's threatening to deploy every tool in our arsenal if they don't comply. And what's interesting here from a conservative perspective is how this marks a shift, right? Away from automatic corporate support toward a more populist, maybe America first critique of corporate power.
Exactly. And it's not just Trump saying this from the top down. There was a national survey, February 2025, showing overwhelming bipartisan support for lowering drug costs. Get this. Nearly 2/3 of all voters, and that includes 64% of Trump voters, hold intensely unfavorable views of drug companies. That's a really powerful number. It shows deep public discontent.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Who do people blame? According to 59% of voters, the primary blame for high costs falls squarely on drug company profits, not R&D, which is the industry's usual explanation. So it raises this big question. Why are conservatives, traditionally, champions of free enterprise, now so critical of Big Pharma?
Well, the Washington Examiner has an interesting take. They suggest that for what they call the new populist anti-corporate right, Big Pharma has actually betrayed conservative values, moved away from America's best interest.
Yeah.
It's framed as a breach of trust, not just economics. And this criticism also points to pharma's efforts to undermine programs like 340B.
All right, the 340B program. Let's connect the dots there. That program, created back in '92 by Republican Senator Orrin Hatch, requires drug companies to give discounts, big discounts, to hospitals and clinics serving lots of Medicaid patients, other vulnerable groups. And it's not insignificant. It saved beneficiaries something like $98 billion in medical costs just in 2024.
And sources suggest Big Pharma is, quote, on a rampage against this program. They're actively trying to dismantle it because, well, it costs them money, plain and simple. But this directly impacts often lower-income rural populations, the very people often described as America First Republicans. So you see the clash. It's corporate interests versus the interests of a key conservative voter base. And Pharma's fight against 340B kind of hands ammunition to that America First argument that maybe big business isn't always aligned with everyday Americans' needs.
Okay, so that same demand for accountability we see on pricing, it extends right over into another huge area, transparency around COVID-19 vaccine data. Public trust there has been, well, shaky. President Trump has turned his focus here too. On September 1st, he was on Truth Social expressing deep frustration, demanding Pfizer and others publicly justify the success of their COVID vaccines.
He claims he was shown extraordinary results privately by companies like Pfizer. But then he asks, pointedly, why these results never seem to show those results to the public. Why not?
Yeah.
It highlights this critical need for public data to, as he put it, clear up this mess at the CDC, especially with public opinion so divided and skepticism running high. The underlying message is transparency is the way back to trust.
And speaking of the CDC, reports say the agency is facing serious turmoil under President Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s administration. He recently fired the director, Susan Monterez, apparently for not implementing policies that were skeptical of vaccine efficacy. That led to several other top leaders leaving, too. It's a major shakeup.
Yeah, the former CDC chief medical officer, Deborah Howery, she publicly stated she believes President Kennedy Jr. gets his views from outside groups rather than agency experts. She said she was surprised by policy decisions made without science, which, raises that fundamental question about public health. How do you ensure decisions are grounded in solid scientific consensus, especially when leaders themselves are questioning the science?
And you see this shift reflected in the FDA's latest COVID vaccine recommendations for the fall, too. Now, they're broadly advised mainly for people 65 and older, and younger folks with serious health issues. Healthy kids, young adults. Generally not advised to get them without talking to a doctor first. That's a big change from the earlier broad recommendations. Former Trump Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams actually criticized this, saying it seemed to contradict earlier promises of wide access, so there's definitely tension there.
And we have to acknowledge, this whole environment, conflicting info, political shifts, it's fertile ground for misinformation, unfortunately. We saw that example where online groups misinterpreted Pfizer trial documents, claiming only 12% efficacy. That was debunked, clarifying how they wrongly counted unconfirmed suspected cases, but the confusion spread fast.
So what's the takeaway? The real challenge isn't just playing whack-a-mole with false claims after they pop up. It's about providing clear, transparent data up front to stop those misinterpretations from even starting, which is exactly what President Trump seems to be demanding from the drug companies now. Put the data out there, let people see it. Okay, but there is another side to this debate, right? The pharmaceutical industry, some policy experts, particularly those coming from a more traditional, conservative, free market angle, they push back hard against price controls. They warn it could absolutely cripple innovation, that market forces are what drive progress.
Right. The Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, ITEF, makes this case strongly. They argue the U.S. pharma industry is the most R&D intensive industry in the world. They invest over 20% of sales back into R&D every year. And their big concern is that price controls could slash R&D spending by, staggering amounts, $75 billion to $200 billion over the next decade. And that could mean potentially as many as 100 fewer drugs entering the market. Fewer cures, fewer treatments. A huge potential loss.
And their argument, effectively, is that while other countries might get lower prices because of their government controls, they often don't get access to the newest, most cutting-edge drugs that Americans often take for granted. They point out the U.S. has been the medicine chest of the world historically. Like 87% of new global medicines between 2011 and 2019 were available here first. The fear is losing that edge, that innovation engine.
And if you connect that to the bigger picture, the worry is imposing strict U.S. price controls could lead to a loss of U.S. biopharma leadership, potentially to China, which is investing heavily in this area. So that raises big questions about global competitiveness, even national security. Are we willing to risk future breakthroughs for lower costs today? It shows a tension even within conservative thought. Free markets versus that populist call for corporate accountability.
So the tension is just incredibly clear. It's a really high-stakes balancing act.
Yeah.
How do you meet this undeniable public demand for lower drug prices? People are hurting. But how do you do that without damaging the innovation engine that produces life-saving treatments? Especially when, as we heard, a big chunk of the public feels kind of betrayed by these companies already. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's obvious the whole pharmaceutical landscape is just a battleground. Competing interests everywhere. You've got the drive for innovation clashing with the demand for affordability, and underneath it all, this critical need for real transparency. From presidential orders challenging global freeloading, as they put it, to basic questions about vaccine efficacy and your right to see these debates, they have huge implications for your health, your finances, and your trust.
Which really leaves us all with a vital question to think about, doesn't it? In this time, where trust feels so fragile and the stakes are incredibly high, how do we, as a country, create an environment where that life-saving innovation truly thrives? but also operates with complete transparency and at a cost that's genuinely fair for all Americans. How do we restore that fundamental faith in our healthcare system in both the science and the industry? Something to really chew on.